Welcome back to the Critique on Kaizen. We're diving straight into this analysis of the Charlie Kirk Memorial Service. It's a really detailed look at the political and religious messaging from people like Kirk, Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, it gets right into it.
And we're basically asking, was this event, high stakes for sure, but was it a genuine spiritual revival? Or was it more of a carefully staged political event, really meant to kick off the next big phase of the culture war?
That's the core question.
So, if you want to sharpen how you analyze this kind of political theater, definitely stick around. We're going deep. Quick question for you all listening. Revival or spectacle? Type N for revival, Y for spectacle right now in the comments.
Okay, let's get into it.
All right, first up, that core conflict, the rhetoric. I thought the piece did a good job initially capturing these two really different messages coming from the same stage. You had Kirk's really strong statement on Christian forgiveness.
Yeah, very powerful.
And then, almost side by side, these really direct political calls for, well, essentially holy war and getting even.
That tension is definitely there in the text. But I think maybe the analysis doesn't quite hit the, let's call it, the nuclear core of the argument, because it doesn't fully synthesize that conflict.
Okay.
Just putting the messages next to each other, it kind of weakens the point. The piece needs to really grab onto that spiritual dissonance, See it as the defining thing, psychologically and politically, about the whole event.
I see what you mean. It captures the contradiction, sure, but maybe the political reality is just that grace always gets pushed aside by retribution when the stakes are this high, especially at political funerals like this.
Well, possibly.
So maybe the weakness isn't failing to synthesize, but maybe the analysis needs to lean into the idea that the spiritual message was always meant to play second fiddle to the political one.
That's precisely the question the analysis needs to tackle head-on. So the topic sentence we're focusing on here is, the analysis misses the nuclear core of the argument by failing to fully synthesize the dramatic conflict between Christian forgiveness and political holy war being waged from the same stage.
Got it.
The weakness is, like you said, it captures these two wildly different things. Kirk saying, quote, the answer to hate is not hate. The answer we know from the gospel is love. And talking about forgiving the killer because it was what Christ did and is what Charlie would do.
Very clear message of grace there.
And then you have figures like Benny Johnson talking about a godly mission of wielding the sword against evil. Or, Trump's immediate talk about political payback against opponents. You can't just list those. That tension, that clash, that's the story.
Okay, so the suggestion then is to really reframe the whole analysis around that dissonance, make it central. The critique needs to dig into whether that really charged political messaging just swallowed up the grace message, or maybe even, betrayed it.
Exactly. Think about it. You have the mother offering this profound grace. And then just moments later, the former president is basically vowing to escalate political fights. Doesn't that moment become like the ultimate political Rorschach test for the American right?
That's a really interesting way to put it.
So, for concrete examples, you've got to put Kirk's forgiveness statement right up against Trump's move to escalate, like his documented comments, I hate my opponent and I don't want the best for them. Frame the critique by asking point blank, did the politics betray the spirit, or was the spiritual message just, as Pastor McCoy apparently suggested, an on-ramp to Jesus that ultimately serves a political goal?
Asking that directly elevates it. It goes from just noticing something to making a real argument about the political strategy.
Precisely. It moves from observation to actual definitive commentary.
And if that spiritual message was betrayed right there in that moment, you have to ask why. Why was that necessary? And I think the answer has to be it was needed to build this political legend of Charlie Kirk, which brings us right to the next point about legacy and the martyr narrative.
Perfect transition. Yeah. The document does a decent job showing Kirk's influence, especially on younger conservatives. It mentions Turning Point USA's growth, the surge in chapter requests after his death, framing him as a hero, a martyr for the cause.
Right, it sets that up.
But to really make that martyr rebranding analysis hit hard, it needs to put that narrative of selfless heroism right next to the, let's say, more controversial documented facts of Kirk's actual political history.
I completely agree. So, the topic sentence is, To maximize the impact of the Martyr rebranding, the analysis must better juxtapose the memorial's narrative of selfless heroism against the controversial documented reality of Charlie Kirk's political history.
Exactly.
And the weakness is pretty clear. Talking about his legacy feels kind of empty, or at least incomplete, if you don't acknowledge the stuff that really challenges that heroic picture. The friction points, basically.
Yeah, you have to integrate those friction points. That's the suggestion. Bring in the darker side of his documented political record, especially things tied to election activities, some of the inflammatory language he used. You need that to show the scale of the political reshaping that was happening right there at the memorial service itself.
Okay, so this means slowing down a bit in the analysis and really contextualizing some potentially explosive facts. Like, for a concrete example, you could contrast that congressional resolution honoring him. You know, the one that condemns the assassination and calls it a turning point for the nation.
Yeah, very strong language.
Contrast that directly with the documented historical record. We know, for instance, he faced some pretty serious legal questions around January 6 funding and activities.
Absolutely. And you need to get specific. Focus on his actual deposition transcript from the January 6th committee investigation. It's public record. It shows him pleading the Fifth Amendment, refusing to answer questions multiple times.
On what kinds of topics?
On things like alleged busting funds from Julie Fincelli, his reported use of Telegram for rally communications, and even whether he thought Trump incited violence. That paints a much more complicated picture, right? A political operative trying to protect himself legally.
Which absolutely cuts against that clean, selfless martyr image they were pushing.
Totally. That juxtaposition is incredibly powerful, and the analysis needs to give it space to land. You have the memorial saying selfless martyr, but the legal documents show him taking the fifth, the right to remain silent on key questions about political money and rally planning.
That contrast needs to be highlighted, definitely.
And don't stop there. Another key point, you have to show the stark difference between the memorial's heavy focus on Christian values and some of Kirk's own pretty inflammatory rhetoric, especially right before his death.
Like what specifically?
Well, for instance, that public comment he made suggesting that political gun deaths are, quote, a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year so that we can have the Second Amendment.
Wow. Yeah, that's critical context.
It really is. That quote kind of reveals the actual brutal cost of the political debates he was right in the middle of. It makes that simple hero label much harder to just accept without looking closer.
So by bringing in these specific documented counterpoints, the analysis shifts. It's not just observing the memorial's rhetoric anymore, it's actively critiquing how a political legend was being strategically built.
Exactly. And remember, the document already mentions that critics said his work fueled hatred. You need that context to really analyze the rebranding effort. Hey, if you folks listening are finding this deep dive useful, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button for Kaizen right now. Don't miss out.
Okay, good point. Let's shift gears now to the immediate aftermath, the ripple effect. The analysis gets that the goal was this feeling of we are all Charlie Kirk now. That part's clear.
Right.
But we need to anchor this memorial not just in the high-flying speeches, but in the immediate real-world political consequences. What did this event actually enable in terms of political action right away?
Precisely. So the topic sentence here is, the analysis of the memorial should be anchored not just in rhetoric, but in the immediate, tangible, political, and cultural consequences it enabled regarding freedom of speech.
Makes sense.
The weakness is spotting the goal, we are all Charlie Kirk now, but not really drilling down into how the memory of the event was instantly used, almost weaponized, to police speech from opponents. That became a huge theme right after the assassination.
So the suggestion is to actually structure a whole section around that sword against evil idea, but show it in action. Detail exactly how political pressure was used right after the memorial to silence people who disagreed.
Yes.
That's where the event's significance really comes into sharp focus, right? It shows it wasn't just a memorial, it was like a launch pad for a major test of First Amendment limits.
That's exactly right. Focus on the immediate crackdown. For concrete examples, you need to detail how that political pressure led to actual, real-world, professional consequences for people. I mean, look at the indefinite suspension of ABC's Jimmy Kimmel Live, right after Kimmel criticized Trump's response to the killing.
And that wasn't just a few angry tweets, right? This was a concerted push. You had the FCC chief, Brendan Carr, making threats. Nexstar actually pulled the show in some markets.
Yeah, it was significant pressure.
That's real-time media manipulation happening. It shows how fast a tragic event can be turned into political leverage against media outlets.
And it wasn't just big names like Kimmel. The impact went further down the chain. There were widespread reports of regular employees getting fired for social media posts that were seen as criticizing our Kirk, or maybe even worse in some eyes, celebrating his death.
With political figures getting involved there, too?
Absolutely. You had people like J.D. Vance publicly pressuring employers. It demonstrates how the lines around free speech and what you can say professionally got redrawn almost overnight, fueled by the political momentum solidified at that memorial.
This is a really crucial area to strengthen the analysis, I think. This pushback against critics, it sets a fascinating precedent for free speech, maybe even a dangerous one. We really want to know what you all think, our amazing Kaizen listeners. If you were writing this piece, which angle would you emphasize more? The Christian grace element or the political retribution that followed? Let us know below. Just write grace or retribution in the comments. We read them all.
Good question for the audience.
Okay, so let's quickly summarize our critique for this really solid analysis. We've pinpointed 3 main opportunities to take this piece and make it truly definitive, just unstoppable political commentary. First, really sharpen that core conflict. Synthesize the tension between Christian grace and political payback. Explore maybe if that spiritual message was deliberately put in a secondary role. Second, you've got to integrate Kirk's more complicated, documented past. Specifically, pull in that J6 deposition testimony, some of the inflammatory rhetoric. That gives crucial context to the martyr narrative being constructed.
Right.
Context is key.
And finally, anchor the whole thing in the tangible, immediate political fallout. Really analyze how the memorial functioned as a launchpad for a crackdown on free speech, using those concrete examples like the Kimmel suspension and the employee firings.
These suggestions, they're really designed to elevate this from a strong analysis, which it is, into something truly authoritative. A piece that fully captures the complexity of this moment in America's culture war theater.
Absolutely. And we really encourage you, the writer, to take these suggestions, revise the analysis, use the incredible energy of the Kaizen community here to make the work even stronger. And please, when you've updated it, submit it back to us. We'd love to see it again for a future critique.
Definitely. Thank you all for tuning into The Critique. Remember to follow Kaizen for more of this kind of constructive feedback that hopefully helps you get better at whatever it is you do. We'll catch you next time.